Welcome to Legal Nurse Podcast. I'm Pat Iyer, your hostess of this podcast, which has now been running since September of 2016. We're delighted to have listeners from all over the world who are tuning in each week as we bring to you insights, tips, and interviews with a variety of legal nurse consultants and medical legal consultants. I have with me today a person who's a nurse, an entrepreneur, an avid traveler who has over 30 years of experience in various clinical parts of nursing, including critical care, ER, critical care transport, and forensics. She has a passion for forensics issues, and it is a type of legal nurse consulting that we don't explore very often, and yet all around us are opportunities to work with attorneys who are handling cases involving criminal allegations. Jenelle Lee enjoys collaborating with attorneys on forensics cases and consulting on them. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Pat. Thank you for having me.
We've talked about forensics. Is this a word that is interchangeable with criminal cases? And what exactly is forensic nursing? I asked you a two-part question there.
Well, forensic nursing has kind of come of age since the 1980s with Virginia Lynch. She was what we think of as the mother of forensic nursing and kind of brought it to the surface. So what we think of as forensic nursing is anywhere where the medicine intersects with legal systems. And this is generally related to crimes. And we look at collecting evidence, presenting the evidence, documenting. There's a whole gamut that goes along with forensic nursing. And of course, these nurses are registered nurses. It is very helpful to have a background and skill set of several years of nursing in order to be able to be a forensic nurse. And many of them come from an ER type background.
And of course, ER is where many victims of crime first land and come into the healthcare system from the EMS stretcher to the ER or emergency department. Tell us about the education. We've mentioned it's helpful to have an ER background, but I'm sure you need more than that in order to be fluent in the forensics world.
Well, in forensics, you're drawing from your knowledge of nursing, your knowledge of all the different diagnoses and medical problems that you have seen and learned about, and then it is taking it to another level. The education for forensics, there are master's programs nowadays. There are doctorate programs as well with many schools of nursing around the United States. It is something that seems to not require a degree as of yet, unless you're working in specific areas. Very rarely do they require an actual master's and doctorate degree. However, we need forensic nurses, and especially in the ERs. We need them in the community. We need them even to work as a coroner or a death investigator. In some cases, a nurse will fill that role, and that is a forensic job. So there are multiple areas of forensics that we can get into. The education just adds another layer of expertise to it. There are also certifications that you can get for different areas of forensics. For instance, a sexual assault nurse examiner through the IAFN, International Association of Forensic Nurses. They offer the sexual assault examiner. Then there's the Academy of Forensic Nursing, and they offer a CFN-C certification or an AFN-C. This is a certification that I recently got through the Academy of Forensic Nursing, and it's more of a generalist, broad certification across all areas of forensics. Then there is the American Institute of Healthcare Professions gives a certification of FN-CSP. So all these different letters that you can add behind your name for credentials that help to set you apart for having knowledge in forensics. And then, of course, on-the-job training is huge these days. So it helps to just add training, education, and the certification. All three combined together.
Yes. And from what you've just shared in terms of the roles of forensic nurses, one in particular that I think is fascinating is a nurse who will go to the scene of somebody who has died and do a death investigation. A perspective that many of our listeners likely have not heard about. It was new to me when I first heard about nurses going into a home, for example, and the question would be, is this person dead because of suicide? Is this person dead because of a murder? You think of pathologists, at least in the crime novels that I read. They are all suited up in white and nobody's allowed to mill around and there's a doctor kneeling over a body, but that could very well be a nurse who is part of that team to help investigate what happened here and then draw some conclusions, which then go into the legal system. Whether those conclusions are always accurate or not is something that you and I will get into as we talk further about when people jump to conclusions that are not warranted. So we've talked about what forensic nursing is, the educational background, certification opportunities, and then some of the subspecialties. You touched on that before, but I'd like to go into that a little bit more. A forensic nurse is a term that it could encompass several roles, and let's talk about those, starting with the sexual assault role that you mentioned.
Okay, when a victim comes into the ER and has had a sexual assault, many ERs, not all, will offer a forensic exam by a trained, sane sexual assault nurse examiner, is what that stands for, whether pediatric or adult. And there's the two different certifications for peds or adult that I touched on earlier. So that happens sometimes in ERs. Some ERs don't have that, especially the more remote community hospital ERs. In those situations, many times the victim will be referred to go to a community center, a freestanding outpatient center for an exam. That's where I work, in a freestanding rape crisis center. And these community-based programs are very helpful for the victims feeling comfortable, taken care of, not victimizing the victim, doing the evidence collection, and creating the whole chart so that their story can be told if it goes to court and has legal proceedings. That is a subspecialty of forensic nursing. Can be very emotional at times. The right person needs to work in that. It's not cut out for everyone to do, especially in my case, I don't do pediatrics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be tough.
Yeah, I find that very tough.
You know, another tough aspect of forensics is the intimate partner violence. You may not know that the first article that I ever wrote was called Domestic Violence, and it was about battered women. It was a real eye-opener for me when I studied this area, because I went into this concept of, well, of course, if you're being strangled or beaten, you would leave. Simple. Out of here. I'm done. But in the process of delving into this area to write my paper and my master's program, which then turned into this article, I found out that there's a lot of nuances that I had not considered. Tell us about how the forensic nurse would interact with a victim or somebody who's alleging that they are a victim, to be perfectly clear and proper in the wording, a victim of intimate partner violence or battered wives, the older term.
Okay. I find it interesting you said that they allege that they were a victim. Most often, we don't see them coming in saying that they've been a victim of interpersonal violence. Usually that comes out in the history. And this is where training and experience is really important for forensic nurses. Um, it's important to get that victim away from the people that are with her, because generally they are not going to talk and tell you what really truly has happened. So you have to kind of keep your radar up when the story doesn't match up, and when the injuries and the bruises and whatnot doesn't seem to match up, and separate the victim, talk to them one-on-one. Interpersonal skills are so important, and making eye contact, sitting at a equal level with your patient or even lower than your patient, telling them you want to keep them safe and that they're safe while they are here. And generally, these conversations take place in the ER. Sometimes a patient will be admitted to the hospital, and you will find out that they eventually will tell a nurse once they have been admitted. But most often, we find it in the ER. And does that help answer your question as far as
Yeah,
how you take care of them?
it does. I think about people who say they walked into a door, that's
Yes.
explaining the bruises around their neck, which is actually, if you think about it, pretty difficult to bruise your neck without hitting your face. Your chin sticks out more than your neck does.
Yes.
And then the issue that is part of this is that people back away from the allegations. They withdraw their request for a restraining order to prevent their partner from being in the same house with them. It's very difficult from the prosecution perspective of people who simply don't show up. I was talking to our neighbor who's across the street who works in a courthouse. He is a bailiff in essence. And he says when they have domestic violence court, they can count, if they've got 20 people who are scheduled to be before the judge, that 17 of them won't show up.
Yes,
Tell
that
us
is
a
so
little bit
true.
more about that.
Well, most of the time it goes back to the fact that the victim is more afraid of the perpetrator than not. And so they know that their life is going to be worse if they continue forward with it. Now, there are women's shelters and there are different support groups and ways to help protect these victims. However, many times they are torn. It might be that they don't want to leave pets. They might not want to leave their children. Their children are being used against them. There's coercion and control that's going on, and they will retract their story and stay in the situation. They might not have a second car or financial ability to leave, and or ability to get and maintain a job, to be able to be independent. So there's so much other that's going on, and that leads to them staying in the situation. So many of them make multiple attempts to leave before they finally leave. And many times they don't leave until their life is very much in danger. And we also find that femicide, which is death of females by partners, is the number one way for females to die with violent crimes between the ages of 25 and 40.
Mm. And another component of this I learned when I was helping to put together a conference on domestic violence is that the police who go to the scene are also at high risk for being killed by the perpetrator. Typically the male who's beating on the female then turns the rage towards the police officer. So it's highly dangerous for them to intervene in a situation to try to protect the woman at the risk of putting their own life on the line. That's, I think, a terrifying concept if you are working as a police officer and get a call about a domestic violence situation.
Yes. I think generally they call for backup when they know that's domestic violence, but many times they don't know what's going on. I wouldn't want to be a police officer these days. More power to them. I'm glad for what they do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a challenging role.
Yes.
We talked about domestic violence, battered wives, intimate partner violence. I know also there's a component of child abuse and elder abuse that we haven't touched on yet that could involve the skills of a forensic nurse. Can you give us an overview of how a forensic nurse might be involved in those kinds of cases?
When you have a child come into the ER with certain injuries, pattern injuries, bruises that look like fingerprints, um, cigarette burns, um, certain spiral fractures, for instance, your radar goes up automatically as to whether or not child abuse, physical child abuse, has happened. And so then there's certain protocols to go farther with that and to talk to the kids separate from the parent and separate the two parents out. Um,
Mhm.
that is an area where, again, you have to have your education, your training, and your experience helps to combine together to hopefully identify these kids early on to help separate them from the abuse that they're enduring. Um, of course, sexual assault of children is horrible. And in those situations, many times you'll find that one parent has brought the child in and is the one saying and telling the story. Um, so again, separating the parents out, getting a good history. Um, and then elder abuse, it's that is one of the most tragic as well. Anytime that there is someone who is um, elder, child, or disabled, anyone who is not able to truly speak for themselves, act on their own behalf, that is the worst kind of abuse. And so, looking for pattern injuries in an elder, looking to see whether or not their needs are being met. Are they being neglected? Are they being fed? Have they lost a lot of weight lately? Are they being given their medications? Um, do they have what they need to physically be mobile at home? For instance, did the grandson take the grandma's wheelchair and she has no way to get around now? Um, those type of things. You have to keep your ears and your eyes open to those type of things. Another thing we encounter fairly often and is very difficult to prosecute is financial abuse of elders. And we will
Mhm.
run into that, unfortunately, more often than not, especially when there is drug abuse involved.
There was an older woman in my church who got her doctorate at the age of 73. So it gives you a sense that she was pretty clear and coherent. She
Great.
had a woman taking care of her at home and discovered that the woman wrote out a check to herself for $5,000, forged my friend's signature, and took off. Just stole the suitcase, stole the 5,000 and was gone. And never seen again, never showed up for court, never paid for her crime.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if there was substance abuse involved in the motivation behind this young woman who did this to this older woman, but it was such a violation of trust from the perspective of my friend, who was a very trusting individual. Never occurred to her that her caretaker would do that to her.
That is especially the hard part for them because many times it's a caretaker or a family member that's the caretaker, which just adds another level to the emotional assault that they go through.
Hmm.
And um, some of the worst cases that we have had have that I have seen involve financial abuse of persons who are disabled and family take care of that disabled person. But they're not taking care of the disabled person. They're neglecting them and they're simply taking the disability checks. And the patient returns to the hospital over and over again and becomes a pattern of repeats. And that is when you usually start seeing wounds or, decubitus ulcers, which are pressure ulcers from not turning the disabled person. So then your radar goes up, you start looking, and these, of course, anytime there's abuse, nurses are mandated reporters. And so you have to make a phone call to the appropriate agency and hope that there's going to be some intervention for these people.
This reminds me of a case I worked on with a home health aide who was in New York, who decided to apply for a job in a hospital as a certified nursing assistant. And she showed up for orientation, for a 2-week orientation. And the problem was that she was also simultaneously supposed to be taking care of a woman at home. So she asked her best friend, could you please take care of the woman at home while I go through orientation? And the best friend didn't know about turning and repositioning. This woman developed a pressure injury, got admitted to the hospital. That resulted in an investigation. And then the whole thing unfolded, complete with the timesheets, which I saw that showed that this aide was in orientation at the time she was claiming to be in the home. Good trick if you could figure out how to be in two places at the same time. And
Wow.
if the woman hadn't developed a pressure injury, the fraud likely would not have been uncovered, but it was the neglect that resulted in exposing the aide.
Yes, she thought she was going to get away with that. That is horrible. And this is a perfect example of how a person who can't speak for themselves, elder, disabled, or a child, um, they get taken advantage of. Super sad. Multiple areas of forensics out there.
Mm-hmm. Tell us about the attorneys who hire nurses to work on forensic cases.
Well, okay, so it would be either a plaintiff or a defense attorney. Either side, they want to know the truth. They want to know the facts. They want to know as much of the whole story as they can possibly get before they go to court. So both sides would like to have this and hire forensic nurses to look into their cases. Any case that involves medical records and criminal activity, a forensic nurse can definitely help in, but it's not necessarily just criminal activity that a forensic nurse helps in. Um, just cases within the hospital, like we have talked about. And I'll share with you soon another case that I recently had that I got involved in as a forensic nurse. All of these involve being able to look from a broad perspective at the medical records, do analysis, work with other medical care providers as well, um, review the doctor's notes, review the labs, put the story together, and try to determine if the injuries or the pattern of injuries actually, and the story actually makes sense. Um, so the attorneys like to know that. They like to have another set of eyes to dig into the medical record and say, you need to look right here. This doesn't make sense. Or, no, it actually does make sense because look at the patient's lab work. So when I say, to answer your question, I would say both plaintiff and defense attorneys, both civil and criminal court, all of them want to know as much of the story as possible. And collaborating with a legal nurse consultant who is a forensic nurse just strengthens their case. And we like to say contributes to the broader pursuit of justice.
Well, let's finish off this discussion with talking about the case that you mentioned before I ask you the last question, which will be how can our listeners find out more about you and your services?
Okay, I want to share with you a case of a young woman. She was 28. She had a 1-year-old baby at home, and she was brought into the ER by family members. And very quickly, the ER nurses determined that there was some level of abuse going on at home. She had bruises in multiple stages of healing all over her body. She had lots of scratches on her body. She had a really large abrasion on her right upper thigh. She had two, what appeared to be cigarette burns about the size of a dime on her chest. And they were red and angry looking. Um, she had a fracture of her foot and was in a walking boot. She said that she had fallen down the stairs to have sustained that fracture. So, of course, the ER nurses are all thinking, this woman has been beaten. This woman was pushed down the stairs. And it didn't help that her story changed, the patient's story changed. Every time you talk to her, the story was different, and of how she got the round circle marks on her chest or how she broke her foot. Um, so the nurses alert the doctor. Both the nurses and the doctor put in the chart their suspicion of abuse. They admit her to the ICU with concern for safety for her. And the ICU is a safer place. We have locked doors on both sides of the unit. You have to be let in and out. So it's a better place for potentially abused women. So I received this patient as my new admit. And they say, Jenelle, we want you to take care of this patient because you understand the forensic side of it and you could get to the bottom of this. So, of course, we do a head to toe assessment. We see all the bruising and all the marks and all the scratches and abrasions and what look like burns, and talk to the patient, and don't let the family in right away. We keep them out while we're, assessing her and all of that. And something just doesn't add up. So I get to the mom. I go to the hallway. I talk to the mom in the hallway separate from the patient. And the mom gives me a completely different story. The mom tells me that she knows her daughter has been drinking at least one bottle, 26 ounces of vodka a day, that she's been drinking for years, and that she had altered mental status, and which was another reason that they brought her in, that she's seeing things and kind of having delusions. And that's why her story is not matching up, right? I'd already identified that there was something there. And so then I talked to the husband. I thought, well, I can't go 100% by what the mom says. So I talked to the husband in a different location. His story sounds exactly like the mom's. Both of them tell me exactly how she broke her left foot and exactly what the marks are on her chest. And so we go down that route. Then I talk to the dad, completely separate from everyone else. Again, his story collaborates. Mom, dad, and husband all collaborate. Their stories match. But the patient's stories still are all over the place and disjointed. So the first set of labs come back, and I talk with the provider, the admitting doctor, and we look at the labs and we think, wait a minute, she has elevated liver enzymes. We have a history of alcohol abuse. It really definitely looks like we are going into liver failure here. And she's very slightly jaundiced. So I leave my shift and I'm off for a week. When I came back, this was the 8th day of her admission. She's still there. And unfortunately, this is how sometimes in healthcare there will be a suggestion and there will be groupthink, and everyone wants to go down the exact same route. And because the initial suggestion was of abuse, They were continuing to go down that road a week later, and the patient was still there. She was walking on admission. By the time I got her on her 8th day, she was unable to sit on the side of the bed without assistance and had really not been getting out of bed at all. Her labs had gotten significantly worse. Her bilirubin was sky high. She was very jaundiced now. Um, and she definitely was showing signs of liver failure. Her coagulopathy was very high. Her bruises, we determined, were related to liver failure, which causes coagulopathy. And her abdominal, she had complained of abdominal pain and not wanting to eat, being nauseated, had vomited somewhat. Um, the family was worried that she wasn't eating. Well, abdominal pain goes hand in hand with liver failure. She also had swelling in all of her extremities, and she had ascites, which is really bad swelling in the abdomen. Um, she looked like she was pregnant. Her abdomen was so swollen by the time I got her on the 8th day. Her swelling in her extremities had led to her not wanting to wear the walking boot for her broken leg, or broken ankle, I should say. And the swelling had made it where it was so uncomfortable and it was too tight. So everything kind of added together. The scratches on her body were because liver failure causes pruritus, which is a very itchy skin, and she was just digging at herself with her fingernails. The 2 spots on her chest, they had been little pimply spots, she said, and she had picked at them, but she continued to pick and pick and pick, and as they healed, they would be itchy, and she would pick, and they were perfectly round, but she was doing it with her fingernails. So once we had a diagnosis, we knew that this was not abuse, even though it looked like abuse. And it just took someone digging into the chart a little more. I came on the 8th day and I find that they're still talking about abuse. So there were multiple phone calls that had to be made. The provider had changed multiple times throughout her stay. So each time that there was a new provider, they didn't necessarily go back all the way through everything, through the whole medical record. They would read the previous provider's notes. And again, like I was talking about that group think. And so it had delayed, the group think had delayed her being diagnosed, delayed her in being treated, delayed transferring to a higher level of care. So on her 8th day, all of a sudden, the goal was to transfer her to a higher level of care where there was a hepatologist actually on staff in the hospital. And we worked, the provider, case manager, myself, the family, the insurance company, we all worked for probably 8 hours that day to get her transferred out to a higher level of care where hopefully she will do better. And yes, it was not anything related to abuse in the end.
That's an incredible story, Janelle. Yeah. And so fortunate that you could use your knowledge to put it together to help identify what was the cause of this woman's symptoms. We know that other children in child abuse cases, for example, there have been conclusions, erroneous conclusions about why a child suffered an injury or died as a result of a medical problem, as opposed to a child abuse action. Everything is not as it seems, and you've given us a great example of that. I know that our listeners are going to be curious about how to contact you and find out more about what you offer. What would be the best way for them to do that?
You can catch me on LinkedIn, or you can email me or go to my website. So my email is Jenelle@sealconsulting.com, and Jenelle is spelled Jenelle at Seal, that's SEAL, consulting.com. My website is sealconsulting.com, and my LinkedIn is Jenelle Lee, Lea is my last name. So you can find me any one of those three ways. And I'm happy to discuss cases and collaborate with people, whoever want to just run a case by me. I love this stuff.
Thank you, Jenelle. I
Yeah.
appreciate the stories that you've shared, the insights that you've brought to this. This is a challenging aspect of legal nurse consulting, and one in which we can make a huge difference in terms of outcomes.
Yes. Yes, we need all the facts to come together to tell the whole true story.
Be sure to hang on a few more minutes, find out who's coming up next on Legal Nurse Podcast. Thanks for spending the time to listen to this podcast, whether it's through our audio channels or on YouTube at Legal Nurse Business, which is where we have the video version of our podcast. And you have to watch the video version to find out that Jenelle and I independently chose the same color clothing today, and we're perfectly satisfied when we both showed up this morning to record to find out that we had gotten the memo about what color clothing to wear.
There's that group think, Pat, between you and me.
I know. It's a wonderful thing when it works. Thanks so much, Jenelle, and I will see you, the viewer, on our next podcast. Coming up next, you'll have an opportunity to hear from a nurse who is at the bedside taking care of our littlest patients in the neonatal area. And she is a legal nurse consultant who began exploring this field 3 years ago. Abby, tell our viewer or our listener, what are some of the topics that we covered in your podcast?
So we talked about how I investigated and got into legal nurse consulting, the program that I used to learn more about it, how I got my first case, and my marketing strategies. We'll talk a lot about LinkedIn and how I use that platform to grow my business and the results I've gotten from being consistent there, and how I've adjusted my strategies since beginning, starting out as a legal nurse consulting to now.
Go on to LinkedIn and connect with Abby Rogers and watch what she's doing with her posting to learn from her even after this podcast is over. And be sure to come back or click to the next episode and listen to Abby Rogers share her experiences growing her business through social media and specifically LinkedIn. I'll see you then.